Do you know what little c culture refers to? Little c culture refers to everyday life sorts of things, the customs, the habits, the ways in which we interact with each other that may not be connected with great works of art or great civilization traditions, but are very important. In a sense, it's the ways that we interact with each other so that we act in what's sometimes called a culturally appropriate manner. There was a theorist that talked about this whole notion of culture by the name of Hector Hammerly, and the way that he pictured it is that in order to perform well in a foreign language, you need linguistic competence. At the center of it, you've got to be able to speak accurately, with good pronunciation, with proper word choice. But it's not enough to just have the linguistic competence. You've got to be able to communicate. So surrounding the linguistics competence is what's called communicative competence. It's sort of like rings on a tree. If you think about that, if you look down into a tree that's been cut down, you have at the heart. The heart of that, the oldest part in a sense, is the linguistics competence, surrounded by communicative competence. But all that has to function in what sort of a context? The culture. So you have a linguistic core for which you communicate in a culturally appropriate manner. And that leads some theorists to talk more about that we need to think about culture not just as something that is a thing, like a work of art, like a play, like a piece of music. We want to think about culture as performance. Culture is something that you do so that you act in a culturally appropriate manner. And that, if you'll notice, is in Standard 2. What's the first one of those listing? And it's not doing it that is more important than the other. What do they say? Relationship between the practices and perspectives of a culture. You're talking about how you perform culture. In other words, how do you act in a culturally appropriate manner? So for example, what are the proper ways in which you address those that are older than you, as opposed to those that are the same age as you, as opposed to someone that is younger than you? You would not want to use the same form of address to a senior member of your family that you would use to address your little brother or little sister. We have different ways of addressing people in many cultures. But also an understanding of the relationship between the products. And that would refer to what we've more traditionally thought about culture, like works of art, foods. Those too are representations of the culture. When Blas, who was the one I was talking about that came up with that chart that we looked at the beginning of the hour, she noted that along with communication, it was most widely addressed of all the so-called 5 C's. If you look at most textbooks, there's a lot of attention paid to communication and a lot of attention paid to culture and less paid to the connections, the communities, and the comparisons. So again, what I'm drawing from this notion of culture as performance. A couple of specialists in Chinese and Japanese, Galal Walker and Madi Noda, have talked about culture as something you perform. So what I'd like to do before we take the break is for you to break up into groups of about 3 to 5. So I'm saying for the Arabic speakers, 3, 3, and 4. And for Chinese, 5, 5, and 5. You sort of self-select yourself. And I just would like you to brainstorm for yourself. And we're not going to have time to do 3 activities, but just come up with one activity that you could think of in which you could talk about culture as being something you perform. What could you do as far as being a student with your students that they could perform culture. And some of them may be very obvious sort of things, some of them may be somewhat different. Think about the examples that I talked about previously, and don't use those. Talk about how you would address someone and how that would be a reflection of the culture. Think about other ways in which you might perform culture. And as I said, it doesn't have to be high culture or big C culture. So go out and select yourself into your groups. Find, in the case of the Arabic teachers, find 2 or 3 of your fellow teachers, and for Chinese, find 4 of your fellow teachers. And just